RIP your laptop, very sad. Everyone drink to the laptop. Laptop died, very sad, in memoriam of the laptop. Hi, I am Dr. Ashley Brown, and I'm a lecturer in game design and game studies at Brunel University London. My contact information is up there. Should you want to ask me questions about the presentation, because we can't take Q&A, feel free to tweet me or email me, or alternatively, find me at the bar. That's where I'll be for the rest of the night, clearly. So when I was asked ages ago to do this talk, Mount Your Friends, the image I got in my head was something like this. By the way, I love pre-Raphaelite art because they really had a thing for greased up men wrestling, which is what it is, right? Definitely just wrestling. Yeah. So I didn't know, because I'm bad at my job, that it's actually a game, right? But it's remarkably similar to the pre-Raphaelite art. So I'm going to talk to you today, anyway, that little joke aside, I'm going to talk to you today about basically what players want out of sex in games. So I have a social behavioral background. I'm a social scientist by training. And I study players, and I do research on how people play games, how people interact with games, things like emergent play. But actually, what happens when people try and implement sexuality in games in really cool and interesting ways is usually that they're deemed bad players. They're breaking the social rules of the game, right? Because games are only for children, and grown-ups can't possibly want anything from games, right? Not really. So my title comes from the fact that sex is typically good. Games and sex can be good, can be a good thing. But often when we try and put sex in games, we demonize the player. So what authority do I have to speak about this? I have a book. Actually, I've written many books, many chapters in books, many things, on the topic of sexuality in games and morality in games. I should mention now, there's side butt. I had to put nudity in the presentation because nudity. So if you are offended by side butt, please look away at the next slide. I think there's also really horribly pixelated nipples as well, so there might be that. But the first argument I'm going to make is that good sex is playful sex. As we see from these, they're actually not wrestling. These greased up gentlemen are not wrestling. They are playing Twister on a float at a Pride Festival. But in the late 80s, early 90s, when we had the California cult of the self, Anthony Giddens wrote about it, and people were looking to improve their lives, one of the things that relationship therapist William Betcher said was, to improve your sex life, don't turn it into work. Make it playful. Good sex, with the exception, we're clearly not talking about abuse or violence or anything like that, but good sex is playful sex. Because when we're playful, we're not afraid to make mistakes, we're not afraid to experiment and to try new things, to have a laugh at those squishy sounds that your bodies make, that kind of thing, right? So play is a regular function of romantic relationships. So not only do we play when we flirt with people, and we kind of joke around in sex, but also when we have relationships with each other, it's romantic, intimate relationships tend to be playful. So Valentine's Day, we just had Valentine's Day, right? Did anyone go to the cinema on Valentine's Day and vomit profusely from all the cute, cuddly couples? We know when people are a couple, they do things like have pet names for each other and play with each other. By the way, Brian Sutton Smith, who's this author, he wrote about playing hide the thimble, which I guess is an Australian thing. I had to Google it. If you Google it, safe search on, guys. Safe search on. It is what you think it is. It is what it sounds like. So in short, sex and playfulness is like a hot fudge sundae, right? You have sex, which is awesome, like ice cream, and you have playfulness, which is like fudge and super awesome, and you put them together and it's even more awesome. So theoretically, play and games aren't the same thing, and I'm not going to go into defining games because I totally bore you all, but logically you could say that if sex and playfulness are good, then sex and games should be good. But it doesn't quite work out that way. Sex and games is kind of like this melted ice cream that someone tried to save by putting a happy face on it, but it still looks really sad. And this is down to something we call indexicality. So sex and games often is indexical, which means it's a very literal representation. So this is kind of like pornography, right? The representation is literally the activity. So you have two people doing the horizontal hula. I also looked up synonyms for sex for this presentation because I'm old and I have to Google these things. So it's this very literal representation. And there's a time and a place for pornography. There's a time and a place for indexical representations of sexuality in games. Super awesome, fun time. But sometimes it can be a bit disappointing. How so, you ask? Well, kind of like this. So I have examples from games that I actually quite enjoy. I have Saints Row, I have God of War, and the infamous hot coffee mod. Not bad, definitely not critiquing them, definitely a time and a place. But when we're talking about representations of sexuality, it often falls a bit flat. So Brenda Brathwaite, now Brenda Romero, talked about sex as an aesthetic. So that's about getting to the form and the feel of sex in a game. So it's going beyond those really literal representations of sex as an activity and getting to the kind of feeling of intimacy with someone. Some games do that. We have Luxuria Superbia as an example, which is a game where you travel through the center of a flower by touching the petals of the flower. And like Georgie O'Keeffe would say, it's definitely not a vagina, definitely not a metaphor for female pleasure at all. It a little bit is. It's a tablet game, and you actually touch the walls of the flower to progress through the game. Likewise, we have Fingal. Kelly's in the audience. I got this game because Kelly said, oh, it's this really interesting game where it's kind of like Twister, but you play with your fingers. So Kelly walked into my office and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm fingling myself, without realizing how wrong that sounds. But Fingal kind of gets at the flirtatious, touching, moving kind of feeling that sometimes comes from play. All this to say, to connect it back to my research. So it's really, really difficult to say what players want from sexuality in games, but I studied groups of players who put it into a game like World of Warcraft where it ordinarily wouldn't exist. So I look at emergent gameplay, sexuality in emergent gameplay. And I have to look at sexuality in emergent gameplay because usually it's regulated against. So because rating boards cannot account for interactive gameplay like in Goldshire or cybersex, I can then go and study it. So this is where the bad player section of my talk comes in. Blizzard's terms of use state rather problematically that while engaging in chat, you may not transmit or post any content or language which is sexually explicit. But in addition to the sexually explicit language, they include things like that's harmful or threatening or all these other types of bad player behavior. And sexual activity is thrown in there. The assumption being that only deviants would include sexual content in their play, which wasn't really the case, and it's not really true. So my research studied a guild of people playing World of Warcraft on a role-playing server who engaged in the practice of erotic role-play. So think of cybersex, but in character. And what I found was actually they engaged in the behavior for a variety of reasons, not just getting off, although getting off was certainly part of it. One of the things that came out of my study was that people enjoyed being creative. They wanted a chance to express themselves creatively. So players would engage in erotic roleplay as a means to co-author fantasy erotica, essentially, which allowed them to express themselves. And why not? When we think about the great stories of our time, when we think about, let's take Shakespeare for an example. Romeo and Juliet's about two teenagers wanting to bone. Really, that's what it comes down to. And yet we readily accept that. Yeah, of course we can have these romantic narratives in fiction, but we don't accept it in games? Now, obviously, there are other issues going on with the ESRB, with parents wanting their children to be safe, and I'm by no means critiquing that. Obviously, everyone has a right to be safe online. But what I'm suggesting here is that maybe there needs to be another space for adults to play and adults to engage in sexuality in this really kind of cool, creative way. The other thing that came out of my study was that people who engaged in erotic roleplay did so for friendship, or rather, friendship came out of the activity. So I assumed, naively, that when people would erotic roleplay together, they would end up developing some sort of romantic relationship. But that turned out not to be the case at all. And actually, it was kind of like watching dog owners at a dog park. The dogs would be playing, their characters would be engaging in sex, whereas the two players would just be like, oh, how's your day? How's the weather? And they would develop friendships. So much so that they would talk out of character and call each other on the phone and just be friends in a totally normal, I don't like using that term, but in this very mundane kind of way. So there are 2 quotes from my participants on the screen there. So conclusions. Sex and play and games, when done right, could be a hot fudge sundae, because I think about food all the time. I love food. But often it kind of falls flat. And that's because of these kind of, not the only representations, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the representations of sex that we currently have in games is this indexical, literal representation. And we want to go beyond that. And there's some evidence from my research that players want to go beyond that. And that when they do go beyond that, they get actually a lot more out of it than just boners and white-ons. By the way, we need more terms for female turn-ons, right? Like white-on's a good one. I'm trying to think of some others. Kelly's shaking her head at me saying, don't go down this road. If you know others, find me at the bar later and we'll chat, because I don't like lady boner, because that still relies on boner, right? I want ones only for girls. Okay, women, whatever. Okay, moving right along. So there's a lot more to gain than just simple arousal. But unfortunately, we're not culturally, I think, ready for that. We still have legislation. I'm using legislation, which is a very heavy term here. But fundamentally what I mean is we still have bodies like the ESRB and PEGI that kind of curtail this kind of behavior from happening for fear of upsetting parents and children. And to some degree, rightly so. But I want to make an argument that we need some kind of space to play as adults and have some good sex. Thank you.